The rain had been falling since dawn, a long silver curtain drawn across the late spring plains, soft as breath yet relentless as memory. It blurred the far hills into watercolor shapes and turned the dirt road into a ribbon of mud, but the woman walking it did not slow. Her clothes clung to her like wilted petals. Her hair, once carefully tied, hung in wet strands against her cheeks, and in her arms, wrapped in the thinnest scrap of cloth, lay a newborn whose faint cries were barely louder than the trembling of her own breath. She whispered her steps forward, as though the earth itself might shatter beneath her weight. 7 days without food had hollowed her body to bone and resolve, yet something inside her still burned, a mother's last, unbroken ember. Meilin Jiang had not meant to come this far. She had not meant to live this long, not after being turned away from the camp where she had labored for months. They had said a woman who could not work was a burden, even if the reason she could not stand upright was the newborn sliding breathlessly into her arms. They had sent her off without coin, without shelter, without pity. For 7 days she walked, nursing her baby with what little her body could still give, drinking from puddles and praying to any spirit willing to listen. By the time she reached the edge of the settlement, her legs trembled like reeds in floodwater. The cabins sat scattered across the wet valley like lonely lanterns, each one holding its own hush of survival. Smoke curled from chimneys, horses stamped in distant barns. But one cabin, tucked near a cluster of cottonwoods, carried a stillness deeper than the rain. Its porch sagged slightly, its windows glowed with lamplight, and the man inside moved with the slow precision of someone who had grown accustomed to silence and found a way to fill it without breaking. Caleb Rourke stood at his table, mending a leather strap by the warmth of a crackling fire. His hands were broad, the kind shaped by ranch work, yet gentle in the way they handled small tasks. A widower of 2 quiet years, he had learned to live with the emptiness Lydia had left behind. Her presence still lingered. In the rocking cradle tucked in the corner, in the embroidered cloth draped over the hearth, in the soft blue scarf folded on a shelf he never touched. He did not try to erase her nor summon her. He simply lived beside the memory, like a man sharing a room with a ghost who meant no harm. When the knock came, it did not sound like a visitor. It was too light, too fragile, barely audible beneath the rain. Caleb lifted his head slowly, as though he feared his imagination had played a trick on him. But the knock came again, faint but insistent, a whisper of desperation tapping against wood. He set down the strap and crossed the room. When he opened the door, the lantern's glow spilled onto the porch, illuminating the drenched woman standing there, swaying like a candle flame in wind. Her eyes, dark, exhausted, yet fiercely alive, lifted to meet his. She tried to speak, but the first attempt dissolved into a cough. The second turned into a whisper so thin, it seemed the rain might wash it away. "I have not eaten for 7 days." The words trembled between them, fragile as the newborn pressed to her chest. Caleb's breath caught, not in shock but something softer, deeper, something that pulled from a part of him he'd kept sealed since Lydia's death. He stepped aside without asking her name or her story. His voice came low and steady, a sound meant to guide rather than startle. "Come in." The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her the moment she crossed the threshold. Meilin clutched the baby closer, afraid the heat might somehow break the fragile shell of her reality. Her legs buckled, but Caleb caught her before she could fall, lifting her with a strength that felt impossibly gentle. He laid her near the hearth, the fire's light brushing her face with gold. He examined the newborn briefly, cautious not to alarm her. The child was tiny but breathing evenly. Relief loosened something tight around his ribs. He placed a blanket around them both, and Meilin closed her eyes as though she had forgotten the sensation of soft fabric. Caleb moved quietly, unwilling to startle her with unnecessary noise. He fetched the small pot of broth he had warmed earlier. As he lifted the spoon toward her, she hesitated, her pride and gratitude clashing in the hollow between her ribs. But then the baby stirred, and survival overcame hesitation. She parted her lips, taking the first sip with trembling reluctance, then a second, then a third as tears tracked slowly down her cheeks. Caleb watched without judgment, only quiet understanding. He did not ask how she came here, or why she was alone. Those answers lived in the shadows beneath her eyes, in the way her hands tightened around the blanket, in the whisper of fear she carried like a second skin. The fire crackled. Rain drummed steadily against the roof, a steady rhythm that felt nearly comforting. The cabin seemed to breathe, warming Mei Lin as though recognizing a long-needed presence. But as she finished the last sip of broth, exhaustion swept over her with merciless force. Her eyelids fluttered. Her arms loosened. The baby slid dangerously toward the cradle of her lap. Caleb lunged forward, catching the child before he slipped. Mei Lin's eyes opened just enough to see him holding her newborn with unspoken care. Something flickered in her gaze. Fear, gratitude, disbelief, then faded as her strength gave out. She slumped sideways into unconsciousness. The baby whimpered softly, and Caleb lifted him to his chest, instinct guiding his motions. A storm of questions rose in his mind, but he brushed them aside. In that moment, only two truths mattered. A woman lay fainting on his floor, and a child pressed against his heartbeat. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, distant yet growing closer, as if something unseen was approaching. Something that would test the fragile safety forming inside the four wooden walls of his home. The morning rose slowly, filtering through the thin seams of the shutters in pale bands of gold, touching the cabin with a gentleness the night had not known. Caleb Rourke had barely slept, though his body carried the weight of exhaustion as surely as the beams of the old house carried the roof. He had kept watch beside the hearth, his boots still damp from the rain, the newborn resting in the crook of his elbow with surprising contentment. The tiny boy breathed with soft, fluttering rhythms, as though recognizing safety even before understanding it. Caleb's gaze drifted often to the woman still lying near the fire. Her dark hair splayed across the blanket like ink spilled on parchment. She hadn't stirred since collapsing, and each silent minute carved a deeper worry into his chest. Mei Lin Jiang woke with a gasp that sounded like a memory of drowning. Her eyes flew open, unfocused at first, then darting toward the cradle of warmth beside her. Caleb steadied her with a hand, not touching her skin, only letting his presence rest close enough to anchor her. Her gaze fell upon the baby, resting peacefully in his arms. For a moment something fierce flickered through her, a mother's fear sharpened to a blade, but the sight of the infant unharmed softened her breath. She pressed a hand to her chest, her relief trembling through her fingers. He handed the child back to her with a carefulness that revealed more about him than his silence ever could. She held her baby tight, as though gathering fragments of herself that had scattered across miles of suffering. The fire painted her tired face in shifting shades of amber, and for a moment she simply breathed, as though the cabin itself allowed her lungs to remember how. Caleb moved to the small table. He poured warm broth into a tin cup and set bread beside it. When he brought them to her, she hesitated again, pride warring with necessity, but the hunger lingering beneath her ribs spoke louder than shame. She ate with small, trembling bites, never looking away from the child now nestled in her lap. Caleb pretended not to notice her glancing at him between sips, studying him with a mixture of uncertainty and fragile hope. The cabin around them felt like a place holding its breath. Lydia's belongings sat quietly where they had been left. A blue scarf folded on a shelf, the cradle Caleb had moved near the fire, the unfinished quilt resting over a chair. Mei Lin's eyes lingered on these details with a reverence that came naturally to someone who spent her life navigating the boundaries of other people's worlds. She seemed to understand immediately that this house had belonged to a woman whose absence still shaped its air. "You are safe here," Caleb said. Or meant to say. The words never left his mouth, but the sentiment flickered through the steady way he kept the fire fed and his movements slow. He asked only one question, spoken gently, like a man afraid to reopen a wound. How far had she walked? Mei Lin looked into the steaming cup before answering, her voice pulling itself together like scattered threads. 7 days from the railroad camp. They told me to leave. My baby came early and I... She paused, the memory thickening her throat. I did not know where else to go. Caleb nodded, absorbing every word with a stillness that felt older than his years. He didn't ask the question that tugged at him, why she had been alone through childbirth, because he sensed that answer lived in a place too raw for morning light. Instead he asked her name, and when she gave it softly, almost apologetic, he repeated it under his breath with care, as though committing it to the walls. Mei Lin Jiang. Something changed in her expression when she heard him say it. a shift so subtle one might mistake it for the settling of embers. But in truth, it was the first moment she recognized a space between fear and belonging. As the day stretched, the rain softened to a drizzle. Caleb stepped outside to tend to the horses, leaving the door cracked so she wouldn't feel trapped. Through the thin gap she watched him move with a quiet steadiness, his broad back bending to each task with patience. He seemed like the kind of man who understood the language of storms, the kind who didn't run from them but worked alongside their weight until they passed. Inside the cabin, Mei-Lin wrapped the baby more securely and traced her fingers across the stitching of the old cradle. She whispered promises to him in her native tongue, soft rising tones that floated like tiny lanterns through the air. She did not notice Caleb return until he stood in the doorway, his hat dripping rainwater onto the wood. Something in his gaze softened when he saw her humming to the child, as though a forgotten room in his heart briefly opened its shutters. Mrs. Eloise Harper, the elderly neighbor, came by late afternoon, carrying a bundle of fresh cloth and a jar of broth. Her eyes widened at the sight of Mei-Lin, but they softened quickly, warmed by instinct rather than judgment. She whispered to Caleb near the door, her worry low and earnest. "Folks will talk, you know. But kindness is worth the noise." Caleb nodded, accepting both the warning and the blessing. As evening approached, Mei-Lin attempted to stand, murmuring about leaving so she would not trouble him further. But her legs faltered. Caleb stepped forward instantly, not touching her, simply blocking her path with the quiet solidity of a man who did not shove kindness aside once it arrived at his door. "You cannot walk another night," he finally said, the words rough from disuse. "Stay. Rest." The newborn fussed in her arms, and Mei-Lin's strength sagged beneath the sound. She relented, sinking back near the fire with a trembling breath, the flames reflecting in her eyes like small fragments of hope. The wind began to rise again outside, dragging the fading light into long gray streaks. Caleb added wood to the fire and sat across from her, the crackling flames casting shifting shadows between them. Mei-Lin adjusted the baby with gentle hands, then looked up with a question hovering unspoken on her lips. A question about trust, about tomorrow, about whether kindness in this land ever came without cost. Before she could speak, a sudden knock struck the door, loud, sharp, unexpected, splitting the quiet like a gunshot and freezing both of them in place. The knock echoed through the small cabin like the tail end of a lightning strike, sharp enough to still the flames in the hearth and freeze Mei-Lin where she sat. Caleb rose slowly, not with the alarm of a man startled, but with the wary steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that trouble rarely wasted its breath on whispering. He crossed the room without speaking, boots pressing into the wooden floor with the soft certainty of someone prepared to shield what little peace he possessed. When he opened the door, rain fog drifted across the threshold, cool and silver, carrying the faint scent of wet sage and distant thunder. Sheriff Dane Harper stood there, his coat soaked, his hat dripping, his stern face half-shadowed beneath the porch beam. He pushed the brim up with 2 fingers, revealing eyes that had seen enough of human hardship to know danger when it brushed near. "Caleb," he said quietly, nodding once in greeting before casting a brief glance into the room. His gaze lingered just long enough for Mei-Lin to stiffen and pull the baby closer. The sheriff's stare flicked back to Caleb. "Word spreading through town. Folks heard you took someone in last night. Some say she came from the railroad camp. Some are riled up." His voice carried no anger, only the weariness of a man forced to balance justice on a blade too thin to hold everyone's weight. Caleb answered with a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "She needed shelter. That's all." Sheriff Harper leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, lowering his voice. "I know you. I know Lydia. You wouldn't turn a soul away from your doorstep. But others," he paused, letting the rest hang heavy. "They don't trust the unfamiliar. And fear makes small men dangerous." Mei-Lin, still near the fire, lowered her gaze, though she could feel the sheriff's presence like a cold wind against her thoughts. Her fingers tightened around her child, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her palm, a reminder that she had something worth fighting through any storm for. Caleb stepped slightly forward, blocking the sheriff's view of her. "She's staying until she's strong enough to stand on her own. Whatever the town says, that's not changing." Sheriff Harper considered him for a moment, his expression shifting into something between respect and resignation. I figured you'd say that. Just wanted to warn you. Clint Maddox and some of his boys were stirring trouble at the saloon this morning. Something about curses, bad luck, sickness coming from strangers. Fool talk, but dangerous when drunk enough. If they come near your place, send for me. Caleb nodded, though both men knew he rarely called for help. The sheriff gave one last look inside, then stepped back into the drizzle, his horse stamping impatiently in the wet soil. As Harper mounted, he said over his shoulder, "Don't let the storm catch you unprepared. Some storms walk on two legs." When the door shut, the cabin seemed smaller, its edges drawn in tight around Mei Lin and the baby. A silence followed, not empty but weighted, shaped by the sheriff's warning and the world pressing harder against the fragile space they had carved. Caleb returned to the fire, his presence grounding the room with quiet steadiness. Mei Lin lifted her gaze, searching his face for reassurance, and found instead a softness beneath the rugged lines. Not comfort exactly, but a promise that he wouldn't abandon her. He crouched beside her, eyes resting on the baby for a long moment. "They're only words," he murmured. "Folks talk more when rain keeps them indoors. It'll pass." Mei Lin knew enough of people, in this land and her own, to understand that words didn't simply pass. They spread, twisted, hunted the vulnerable. Still, she nodded, because acknowledging her fear aloud felt too dangerous, as though it might give shape to the darkness waiting outside. Midday brought a thin, pearly light slipping between clouds. Mei Lin asked if she could help with chores, though her body still trembled from hunger and days of walking. Caleb shook his head. "Rest while you can. Strength returns slower than hope." But she insisted on doing something, anything, to repay the kindness she'd been shown. She moved quietly through the cabin, folding blankets, straightening the small table, washing the tin cup with hesitant diligence. Caleb watched her from the window as he checked the sky, the horses, the muddy trail leading toward town. Each time he glanced back, Mei Lin lowered her gaze, not used to a man looking at her without suspicion. When afternoon light softened the edges of the hills, Caleb returned inside with a bundle of firewood. Mei Lin had placed the baby in the cradle, and was mending the torn edge of one of Lydia's old handkerchiefs. She froze the moment she realized what cloth she held. Caleb moved slowly, gently removing the piece from her fingers. "Lydia won't mind," he said softly. "She'd have wanted it used, not left waiting on a shelf." Mei Lin felt something warm gather behind her ribs, a swelling ache that wasn't hunger but something deeper, a recognition of being allowed to exist in spaces touched by loss. The day passed in these small, careful moments, each one weaving them quietly closer. Shadows lengthened, and the cabin grew dim except for the fire that cast soft amber across the room. Mei Lin fed her child, cradling him with the tenderness of a woman who knew the cost of survival. Caleb repaired a fence rail near the hearth, the rhythmic scrape of his knife carving through the quiet. As dusk settled, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like restless hands. Caleb moved to secure the windows while Mei Lin hummed a lullaby under her breath, a melody from a world far across the ocean, lilting and soft, wrapping the cabin in a fragile sense of peace. The baby drifted into sleep, his tiny breaths syncing with the flicker of the flames. Then hoofbeats thundered outside, sudden, harsh, too many to be a traveler passing by. The ground trembled beneath them, shaking loose dust from the rafters. Caleb rose instantly, instinct tightening in his shoulders. He stepped toward the door, placing a steadying hand on the table, as though grounding himself before facing whatever approached. Mei Lin clutched her child and backed into the corner, fear sharpening her breath. The hoofbeats slowed but did not stop. Voices murmured, rough, low, unmistakably fueled by anger and drink. Caleb's jaw set, his eyes shifting like storm clouds gathering purpose. And then a fist struck the door, loud enough to make the lantern quiver. Caleb glanced back at Mei Lin, and she saw it. Not fear, but a decision settling in him like a weight he had carried before. This time, however, he wasn't carrying it alone. The pounding on the door rattled the cabin's frame, each strike echoing through the wooden bones of the house like a warning from the storm itself. Caleb stood tall, shoulders squared, gaze steady on the trembling door. Mei Lin watched him with wide eyes, clutching her baby so tightly the child whimpered against her chest. The fire cast a warm pulse of light across Caleb's face, catching the sharp line of his jaw, and the quiet resolve carved into every feature. Outside, the rain thickened, drumming the earth with restless urgency. The voices beyond the door rose and dropped, blurred by thunder and drink, but their tone carried a familiar bitterness, the kind that fed on fear and found its shape in cruelty. Caleb stepped toward the door, lifting the latch slowly, not to open it yet, but to brace it with the weight of his arm. The pounding came again, harder, then a slurred voice pierced the night. "Caleb Rourke, open up. We know she's in there. Clint Maddox." His voice was unmistakable, the rough drawl of a ranch hand who mistook swagger for strength, a man itching to make someone else bear the weight of his own failures. Caleb didn't look back at Maylin, but the air between them tightened, threaded with unspoken fear and something deeper. A fragile trust beginning to bloom despite the storm clawing at their walls. Clint's voice rose again, louder this time. "That woman brought trouble with her, you hear? Folks say she brought sickness too. Bad luck. You let her stay, the whole valley feels it. Let her out, Caleb. We'll take her off your hands." Caleb felt a cold anger move through him, not hot and reckless, but the steady kind that anchored itself deep. He lowered his voice, roughened by restraint. "Go home, Clint. It's late, and the rain's got your sense drowned. There's no trouble here." A mocking laugh split the air. "You don't get to decide that anymore. We just want to talk to her. Make sure she's not hiding anything. Seen enough strangers cause trouble around here." Another voice chimed in, younger, meaner. "Heard her kid ain't natural, neither. Some kind of omen. That did it." Caleb pressed harder against the door, his breath sharpening. Behind him, Maylin stiffened as though the words themselves had struck her. Her grip tightened around the child, and she whispered something soft in her language, a plea for the night to swallow their cruelty whole. Caleb raised his voice enough to pierce the storm. "You're not coming in. Not tonight, not ever, not like this. Go home before you regret this foolishness." Silence stretched for a breath, then boots scraped against mud. A third man muttered something Caleb couldn't make out, but Clint's anger sharpened, feeding off the others. "You always were soft, Rourke. That dead wife of yours made you weak. Now look at you, keeping a stranger like she's worth something." Rain hissed against the roof. Caleb's knuckles whitened around the latch. "Don't speak her name," he warned quietly, each word shaped like iron. Clint spat near the porch. "Maybe we should help you see sense. Maybe that woman needs real talking to." The threat slid through the walls like a cold blade. Caleb turned slightly, enough for Maylin to see the tension in his shoulders. Something inside her shattered. Fear, shame, the ache of being hunted by people who refused to see her humanity. She whispered Caleb's name, barely audible, but he lifted a hand, steady, reassuring. "I'll handle this." The door shuddered as Clint slammed his shoulder against it. Caleb braced both hands against the wood, muscles tightening under the strain. Another hit. Then another. Each one sent vibrations through the walls, shaking dust from the rafters. Maylin crouched lower, shielding her baby, whispering rapid lullabies to calm him though her own voice trembled. The fire flickered wildly, shadows jumping across the cabin like startled spirits. Caleb pushed back with a grunt, and the door held. "For now. You boys go home," he said, louder this time, voice carrying through the storm. "Sheriff Harper won't take kindly to you breaking into a man's home." Clint laughed again, the sound sharp and unhinged. "Sheriff's not here, Caleb. And we ain't breaking anything. Just trying to see the truth." Another crash hit the door, this time harder, rattling the hinges. Caleb shoved back with every ounce of strength he had. For a moment the force outside relented. Then someone grabbed the latch from the other side, jerking it violently. Caleb forced it down and jammed a wooden rod through the handle, locking it temporarily. Boots stomped across the porch. The men shifted positions, muttering curses. Caleb stepped back from the door, breath harsh, sweat mixing with rainwater dripping down his collar. He turned toward Maylin. "Stay behind me. Don't move unless I tell you." She nodded, her eyes shining with fear and something else, a wordless gratitude carved into the fragile curve of her expression. A window shattered suddenly, glass exploding inward in a spray of shards. Mei Lin cried out, shielding the baby. A man tried to pull himself through the broken frame, his boot scraping along the sill. Caleb lunged, grabbed a piece of firewood from the hearth, and swung with controlled force, hitting the man's shoulder. The intruder yelped and dropped back outside, cursing. The storm roared louder, as if punctuating the violence. More fists slammed against the walls. They're circling, Caleb thought grimly. Looking for another way in. Mei Lin pressed her back to the wall, her breath ragged. Why they hate so much? She whispered. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He didn't have the breath nor the words to explain the smallness of frightened hearts. He scanned the room, searching for a plan. The cabin was sturdy, but not built for siege. The men outside were drunk, loud, but reckless enough to be dangerous. He moved toward the rifle hanging above the mantel but hesitated. Firing it would turn fear into bloodshed, and he knew violence, once begun, rarely stopped where a man wished. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the hills. The men outside paused for a moment, startled by the sky's fury. Caleb seized the silence. Clint, go home. You're outnumbered by the storm and your own foolishness. Walk away now, and no harm done. For a breath, there was only rain. Then a voice, not Clint's, spoke, taut and urgent. Let's get back. This ain't worth it. But Clint snarled, fueled by pride instead of sense. I ain't scared of no storm. That woman's poison. He didn't finish. Because another voice cut through the storm, calm but sharp as a freshly whetted blade. Clint Maddox, you step away from that house right now. Sheriff Harper. The men cursed under their breath. Horses shifted nervously. Rain softened. Caleb exhaled in something close to relief. The sheriff's tone grew harder. I see any of you near this cabin again tonight, I'll throw you in a cell till the sun forgets your names. Boots shuffled. Men grumbled. One by one, hooves thudded away into the wet night. Caleb lowered the log from his grip, chest rising and falling with the slow collapse of tension. Mei Lin sagged against the wall, tears slipping silently down her face as she held her baby close. The sheriff's horse approached the porch. You all right in there? Caleb opened the door a crack. We're fine. Harper squinted into the dim cabin, taking in the broken window, the scattered glass, and Mei Lin holding her child like a shield around her heart. The sheriff's voice softened. Storm's not done yet. Keep your lantern lit so I can see you from the trail. He turned his horse and rode away, hooves steady against the mud. Caleb shut the door gently, leaning his forehead against the wood. The room was quiet except for the rain and Mei Lin's trembling breath. Then, in a voice barely stronger than a whisper, she spoke the words that shifted the air between them entirely. Why you protect me like I matter? For a long moment Caleb didn't answer her question. The fire crackled between them, throwing restless shadows across the cabin walls as though the night itself was trying to listen. Mei Lin held her baby close, her trembling breath shaping the dim space into something fragile and painfully honest. Outside, the storm rumbled, the last of the thunder rolling low along the horizon like a tired beast settling into sleep. Caleb turned away from the door and looked at her. Not quickly, not with the urgency of a man trying to comfort, but with the slow deliberation of someone who had carried a strange ache for too long, and finally saw its name reflected in another's eyes. You matter because you're here, he said at last, voice low, rough, almost unsure of itself. You matter because you're human. Because you're a mother. Because. He paused, breath unsteady. Because I couldn't stand by and let the world take more from you. Mei Lin lowered her gaze, tears slipping silently down her face. In the soft glow of the firelight, her grief looked almost beautiful. Not the kind that broke a person, but the kind that revealed how much strength they had needed to keep living. She touched her baby's cheek, whispering something in her native tongue, a prayer or perhaps a promise. Caleb stepped closer, each movement careful, as though nearing a wild, wounded creature who might run if he breathed too loud. He knelt near her, close enough to offer warmth but far enough to respect the trembling line she held around herself. His hands rested on his knees, calloused and tired, the hands of a man who had built fences, buried loss, and now found himself offering shelter as naturally as breathing. She looked up, meeting his gaze with something raw and searching. Her voice was small, thin, barely more than a breath. "You think I am not trouble? After what happened tonight?" Caleb shook his head. "Trouble came from outside, not from you. You didn't bring the storm. You just survived it." Outside, the wind softened into a whispering lull, brushing against the cabin walls like an exhausted sigh. The baby stirred, making a tiny sound, and Caleb smiled gently despite the heaviness in the room. He reached out slowly, letting his hand hover near the child without touching. "With your permission, of course," he murmured. Maylin hesitated, then nodded, offering the baby forward a little. Caleb touched the child's head lightly with his fingers, a simple gesture, but one that made something shift deep inside her chest, something warm and frightening and entirely new. The quiet moment didn't last. A crack outside, sharp, sudden, split the calm like a snapped bone. Maylin gasped. Caleb rose instantly, grabbed his rifle from above the door, and motioned for her to stay in the shadows. His senses sharpened, attuned to every scrape of wind and rustle of wet leaves. The fire hissed as a droplet from the ceiling hit it, sparks fizzing upward. Caleb's breath steadied into something cold and focused. Then came another sound. Not thunder, not wind, the unmistakable crunch of boots in wet soil. Clint. And this time he wasn't drunk, nor loud, nor accompanied by the careless swagger of earlier. The hush of the night made his presence more dangerous. Caleb moved quietly toward the window, peering through the broken frame, glass shards glinting like scattered tears. In the faint moonlight filtering through clouds, a silhouette shifted near the barn. Hunched, deliberate, cloaked by the storm's last veil. Caleb's jaw tightened. "He's back," he whispered. Maylin's breath stuttered, fear coiling inside her like a trapped bird. Caleb turned to her, voice soft but steady. "Stay hidden. Don't come out unless I call you. Understand?" She nodded, clutching her baby so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Caleb slipped out the side door, the rain slicking his hair against his forehead, mud pulling at his boots as he moved silently across the yard. The clouds parted just enough to spill a weak silver glow over the land, illuminating Clint as he crouched near the barn with a lit oil rag in hand, reaching for the stack of dry hay piled at the corner. Caleb's voice cut through the darkness. "Don't do it." Clint jerked, startled, then snarled, fury twisting his face. "You should have handed her over. She's tearing this place apart. You think tonight's the end of it?" "No. Folks'll blame you for everything now. Rain, sickness, bad harvests. They'll blame her. I'm just stopping the curse before it spreads." Caleb stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "You're the only curse here, Clint. Put that down." Clint's eyes gleamed with something feral. The rag dripped flame. He grinned. "All it takes is one spark." He lunged toward the hay. Caleb sprang with the force of a man who had buried too much to let another innocent suffer. He slammed into Clint, knocking him backward. The rag flew from Clint's hand and landed in the mud, sputtering out. Clint recovered quickly and swung a wild fist. Caleb blocked it, shoved him hard, and the two men grappled in the rain, boots slipping, mud spraying under them. Clint reached for a knife strapped to his belt. Caleb caught his arm. The blade glistened dangerously close to his side. Inside the cabin, Maylin heard the scuffle, the dull thuds, a grunt of pain, the sliding of boots. Her heartbeat thrashed in her chest. The baby began to cry. She hushed him frantically, shaking, unable to stay still. Every instinct screamed to run out, to help, to do something other than kneel in helpless fear. But Caleb's last words tethered her. Outside, Clint broke free for a moment and slashed with the knife, grazing Caleb's shoulder. Caleb stumbled but stayed upright, pain flashing across his face like a fleeting shadow. Clint charged again. This time Caleb moved faster. He disarmed Clint with a swift strike to the wrist. The knife clattered into the mud. Clint lunged again, desperate, but Caleb swung the butt of his rifle, connecting with Clint's jaw. Clint fell hard, sprawling in the muck, dazed. The rain had almost stopped. The night held its breath. Caleb stood over him, chest heaving, blood soaking through his shirt. Clint groaned, tried to push himself up, then collapsed again. Caleb lowered the rifle, breath shaking not from fear, but from the weight of what almost happened. Sheriff Harper's voice carried from the trail. "Rourke!" Caleb turned as the sheriff rode up, lantern swinging from his saddle, catching the scene in its pale glow. The sheriff saw the knife, the mud, the blood, and Clint sprawled unconscious. His expression hardened, jaw tightening. "That's enough," he muttered, dismounting and pulling cuffs from his belt. "Clint Maddox, you're done for tonight." Maylin rushed from the cabin, unable to wait another breath. She saw Caleb's wound and her fear broke into a soft cry. Caleb turned, startled to see her, and something in his stern expression melted. She crossed the yard, mud soaking her hem, baby held tight to her chest. She reached him and touched his bleeding shoulder with trembling fingers. "You hurt," she whispered, voice cracking. Caleb swallowed, his breath uneven, and shook his head gently. "I've taken worse. I'm just glad you're safe." Tears slipped down her cheeks, mingling with the rain still clinging to her skin. "Why you do this? Why fight for me like I am yours?" The question trembled in the air. Caleb looked at her with a quiet aching honesty, as if the truth had been waiting behind his ribs for years. Because somewhere along the way, his voice broke, soft as the first light of dawn. "You became the part of my life I didn't know I'd been waiting for." Maylin froze. The world seemed to fall silent. Even the storm listened. Caleb lowered his gaze, almost ashamed of the confession that had slipped free. Then Maylin stepped closer, so close the baby's breath touched Caleb's chest, and she whispered, not in fear, but with a courage born from everything she had survived. "Then, let me stay. Let me give my child a home. With you." Caleb lifted his eyes, and the moment caught like a flame protected from the wind. Not passion. Not haste. Just two souls, battered and wandering, who finally found the place their roads had always been leading toward. And as dawn broke over the valley, the storm washed clean by light, the cabin behind them no longer looked like a lonely man's shelter. It looked like the beginning of a family.